I wasn't preparing for anything. That's important to understand first. I wasn't stockpiling food. I wasn't worried about shortages. I wasn't trying to be independent or ahead of anyone else. I trusted the system the way most people do, quietly, automatically, because honestly it worked. The store shelves were full. Protein was wrapped, labeled, priced, and waiting. The lights came on when I flipped the switch. Heat filled the room when the temperature dropped. Food arrived exactly when it was supposed to. Nothing felt fragile. Nothing asked anything of me. And I took that as proof that everything was fine. I didn't question where things came from. I didn't think about how much effort it took to keep them coming. That kind of thinking felt unnecessary, almost outdated. People who worried about those things always seemed tense, overprepared, out of step with modern life. So I did what the system rewarded me for doing. I relaxed. Winter came the way it always does. Not dramatically, not suddenly, just quietly, after the season had already shifted. Outside, the ground went still. Inside, nothing changed. And that was the moment I missed at the time. Because nothing breaking felt like confirmation. But it wasn't. It was evidence of something else. Something that had already been decided long before I noticed. I just didn't know what yet. I didn't notice it happening. That's the part that still unsettles me. There was no moment I could point to. No conversation. No headline. No sense of urgency that would have justified paying closer attention. It wasn't a choice I made one evening while standing in a store aisle. It had already been made. Quietly, gradually, in pieces small enough to feel harmless on their own. Each time convenience replaced effort. Each time availability replaced understanding. Each time I reached for what was ready instead of asking how it existed at all. Nothing was taken from me. I handed it over willingly. The ability to produce became unnecessary. The responsibility to know became optional. Strength became something that arrived prepackaged on schedule from somewhere else. And because nothing went wrong afterward, I assumed nothing had changed. That's how the decision hid itself. It dressed like progress. Felt like relief. I didn't feel weaker. I felt taken care of. But standing there later, long after the choice was finalized, I realized the system hadn't removed my options. It had simply stopped requiring them. And when a system no longer asks anything of you, it's not because you've mastered it. It's because it has already decided what you're no longer responsible for. First, it felt like a benefit. The less I had to think about, the easier everything became. Meals required no planning. Seasons stopped matching. Distance disappeared behind packaging and pricing. Food no longer reflected time, weather, or place. It reflected logistics. And that change didn't arrive as a loss. It arrived as comfort. The less I knew, the smoother life felt. The fewer questions I asked, the more reliable everything seemed. Knowing how to produce food used to be ordinary. Not impressive. Not political. Just part of being an adult. But slowly that knowledge stopped being useful. Then it stopped being encouraged. Eventually it stopped being remembered at all. Nothing forced it out. Faded. The system didn't punish forgetting. It rewarded it. The people who remembered how things were made seemed inefficient. Messy. Out of sync with a world that promised speed and ease. Meanwhile, those of us who let go were praised for being modern. Practical. Optimized. I didn't feel disconnected. I felt upgraded. Because when forgetting is rewarded often enough, you stop noticing that you've forgotten anything in the first place. You just notice how comfortable it is to let someone else remember for you. I went along with it, not because I was pressured, not because I didn't know better, but because it was easier not to resist. I liked how little was required of me, how smoothly everything fit into place, how responsibility could be exchanged for access without consequence, or so it seemed. I didn't feel dependent. I felt efficient. I told myself this was what progress looked like. That specialization was smarter than self-reliance. That trusting systems was a sign of maturity, not weakness. And when people talked about producing their own food, I didn't argue with them. I just quietly dismissed it as unnecessary. outdated, excessive. I had options. Stores, services, substitutes. If one thing disappeared, another would take its place. That belief made compliance effortless. I didn't need to learn. I didn't need to remember. I didn't need to practice anything that wasn't immediately useful. So I didn't. And nothing bad happened afterward, which only confirmed the story I was telling myself. I wasn't failing to prepare. I was simply adapting. At least that's what it felt like. Before the first belief started to loosen. The belief was simple. I didn't question it because it had never failed me. Protein was just there. Reliable. Abundant. Something you assumed, not something you secured. Strength came wrapped and portioned. Priced by the pound. Replaced as easily as it was consumed. I let that belief sit comfortably for a long time. I trusted it because it matched my experience. Every time I reached for it, it appeared. Nothing challenged it. Nothing interrupted it. And that's why it held. But one evening, not during a crisis, not during a shortage, I noticed something I hadn't been looking for. Not absence. Availability. How many steps it took for that strength to arrive. How much timing had to stay perfect. How many things had to keep working quietly in sequence without interruption. Transport. Fuel. Cold storage. Processing. Distance. I realized the belief wasn't false. It was fragile. It only worked as long as everything else did. And standing there, with nothing missing and nothing wrong, I understood something that hadn't occurred to me before. I wasn't eating strength. I was renting it. And the lease depended on systems I had never learned how to replace. That realization didn't come with anger, or blame, or the need to point at anyone, because nothing was broken. The system was doing exactly what it was designed to do. It wasn't careless. It wasn't malicious. It was efficient. It favored scale over resilience, speed over redundancy, consistency over adaptability. Protein didn't need to be strong on its own. It just needed to move well, store well, last long enough to justify the distance it traveled. What survived wasn't what nourished best. It was what shipped best. Nothing in that process cared whether I understood it, or whether I could reproduce it. My role wasn't participation. It was consumption. As long as the chain remained unbroken, my dependence stayed invisible. That was the elegance of it. The more smoothly it worked, the less reason I had to question it. The less reason I had to notice how narrow my options had become. I wasn't excluded. I was optimized around. And optimization doesn't announce what it removes. It just quietly decides what no longer matters. Until one day you realize it included you in that calculation. What broke the pattern wasn't discovery. It was embarrassment. I tried to replace what I'd always relied on. Quickly, casually, without understanding. I assumed producing food was just another shortcut I hadn't learned yet. A trick. Purchase. Something you could skim past and still succeed. I failed almost immediately. Not dramatically. Just quietly enough to notice. Things didn't behave the way I expected. They didn't respond to effort the way systems do. There was no interface. No guarantee. I realized then how much had been lost. Not erased, but misplaced. The knowledge wasn't gone. It was still there, unchanged, waiting where it had always been. But I had forgotten how to approach it. Not as a consumer. Not as someone expecting convenience. But as a participant. That was the difference. The people who once knew these things hadn't been smarter. They had just been closer. Closer to limits. Closer to consequences. Closer to cause and effect. I wasn't uncovering something new. I was remembering something I'd never needed before. And that was the unsettling part. The knowledge hadn't disappeared because it stopped working. It disappeared because, for a long time, I didn't need it to. I didn't change everything at once. That's not how it happened. There was no moment of rejection. No declaración. No dramatic shift away from the world I'd been living in. Life still looked the same on the surface. Stores stayed open. The lights still came on. Food was still available. But something subtle had moved. I started paying attention to what worked without permission. to what didn't need approval, branding, or distance to function. Not because I was afraid of losing what I had, but because I finally understood what it depended on. The system didn't notice the change. It wouldn't have cared if it did. That was the strange comfort of it. Nothing needed to be confronted. Nothing needed to be overthrown. All that changed was where I placed a small part of my trust. And once you feel that shift, even slightly, you can't unfeel it. You still live in the same world. You just stop mistaking convenience for permanence. If this felt familiar, or uncomfortable in a way you can't quite explain yet, you're not alone. That's usually where the conversation actually starts. So if you want to keep exploring these quiet edges, the things we forgot not because they failed, but because they stopped being required, take a moment to like this video. Tell me in the comments what part lingered with you the longest. And if you're interested in remembering more of what still works beneath the surface, follow TDA channel. Not for answers, just to keep noticing together.